Dad, I found us a mom.
Nothing but a worthless piece of trash who can't even afford decent clothes for a job interview. The restaurant manager sneered at Emily, his voice dripping with disdain as she stood there in her worn-out dress, clutching her résumé with trembling hands. The upscale Manhattan establishment's marble floors seemed to echo her humiliation as other well-dressed patrons turned to stare, their whispers cutting through her already fragile confidence like shards of glass. Emily Martinez had been searching for work for 3 months since losing her teaching position due to budget cuts, and each rejection felt like another nail in the coffin of her dreams. At 32, she had imagined her life would be more stable, more secure. But here she was, being publicly humiliated by a man who clearly enjoyed wielding his small amount of power over desperate job seekers. Her savings had dwindled to almost nothing, and her small studio apartment in Queens felt more like a prison with each passing day. Meanwhile, across the city in a luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park, Don Massimo Castellano sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing reports from his various business enterprises. At 48, he commanded respect throughout New York's underground scene, but his greatest challenge wasn't rival families or federal investigations. It was his 16-year-old son, Antonio. The boy had been acting out since his mother's death 3 years ago, and Massimo felt helpless watching his son spiral into anger and rebellion. Antonio burst through the front door of their Fifth Avenue penthouse, his designer sneakers squeaking against the Italian marble floors as he called out, "Dad, I'm home, and I brought someone." His voice carried an excitement Massimo hadn't heard in months, which immediately put the elder Castellano on high alert. In their world, unexpected visitors often meant trouble, and the last thing he needed was his son bringing dangerous elements into their home. "Who exactly did you bring, Antonio?" Massimo's voice carried the weight of authority as he emerged from his study, his hand instinctively moving toward the concealed weapon beneath his tailored Armani suit jacket. The penthouse, decorated with priceless art and antiques from Italy, suddenly felt too exposed, too vulnerable for whatever surprise his son had in store. Emily found herself standing in the most opulent home she had ever seen, her eyes wide with disbelief as she took in the crystal chandeliers, silk curtains, and paintings that probably cost more than her entire year's salary. Antonio had approached her outside the restaurant where she'd just been humiliated, offering her a ride when he saw her crying on the sidewalk. She had been hesitant, but something about the teenager's genuine concern had touched her heart. "Dad, this is Emily," Antonio announced proudly, gesturing toward the woman beside him with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he had solved all of life's problems. "She was having a really bad day, and I thought maybe she could stay for dinner. She seems really nice, and you always said Mom would want us to help people who were struggling." Massimo's dark eyes met Emily's, and for a moment, time seemed suspended in the elegant living room. She was beautiful in an understated way, with warm brown eyes that held both vulnerability and strength, her dark hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Despite her modest clothing and obvious financial struggles, there was a dignity about her that commanded respect, something his son had clearly recognized. Emily felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she realized the awkward position Antonio had put her in, standing in this obviously wealthy man's home like some kind of charity case. "I'm so sorry," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told him this wasn't necessary, but he insisted on helping me, and I didn't want to be rude to someone who was being so kind." The tension in the room was palpable as Massimo studied this unexpected guest, his mind racing through possibilities and potential threats. In his line of work, coincidences were rare, and beautiful women who appeared in his son's life needed to be carefully vetted. Yet something about Emily's genuine discomfort and obvious embarrassment suggested she had no idea who they were or what kind of world she had stumbled into. "Please, sit down," Massimo said finally, his voice softer than Emily had expected from such an imposing man. He gestured toward the plush velvet sofa, noting how she perched nervously on the edge, as if ready to flee at any moment. "Antonio, perhaps you could explain how you met Miss—" He raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to fill in the blank while simultaneously texting his security team to run a background check. "Martinez," Emily supplied quickly, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she glanced between father and son. "Emily Martinez, and really this is all a misunderstanding. I was just having a difficult afternoon, and your son was incredibly kind to a complete stranger, but I should probably go home now." She started to rise, but Antonio's disappointed expression made her pause, torn between her desire to escape this uncomfortable situation and her reluctance to hurt the boy's feelings. The evening light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the room, as Massimo found himself genuinely curious about this woman who had managed to inspire such protective instincts in his usually cynical son. There was something about Emily that intrigued him, a combination of vulnerability and inner strength that reminded him of his late wife, Maria, though he quickly pushed that thought away as both inappropriate and dangerous. 3 days had passed since Emily's unexpected introduction to the Castellano household, and she couldn't stop thinking about the strange encounter. Antonio had somehow gotten her phone number and had been texting her regularly, sharing stories about school and asking about her job search with the kind of concern that both touched and worried her. She couldn't understand why a wealthy teenager from Manhattan cared about her problems, but his genuine interest was becoming a bright spot in her otherwise difficult days. Massimo, meanwhile, had received the background check on Emily Martinez, and the results had been both reassuring and troubling. She was exactly who she claimed to be, a dedicated elementary school teacher who had lost her job through no fault of her own, a woman with no criminal record, no debts beyond normal living expenses, and no connections to any of his enemies. The troubling part was how invested his son had become in her well-being, calling her daily and asking permission to invite her to dinner again. "Dad, Emily's interview today got canceled again," Antonio announced as he entered his father's study, his expression reflecting the disappointment he felt on behalf of his new friend. "These people don't appreciate how amazing she is. She taught 3rd grade for 8 years. She speaks 3 languages. And she volunteers at the animal shelter on weekends. Any school would be lucky to have her, but they keep rejecting her because of budget cuts." The passion in his son's voice when talking about Emily hadn't gone unnoticed by Massimo, and it both pleased and concerned him. Antonio hadn't shown this much enthusiasm about anything since his mother's death, but developing attachments to outsiders was dangerous in their world. Yet the boy seemed happier than he had been in months, and Massimo found himself conflicted between his protective instincts and his desire to see his son smile again. Emily was walking through Central Park, trying to clear her head after another disappointing job interview, when she spotted a familiar figure sitting alone on a bench looking dejected. Antonio's usually confident posture was slumped, and even from a distance, she could see the sadness in his young face. Her heart immediately went out to him, and she approached carefully, not wanting to intrude if he needed space to think. "Hey there," she said softly, settling onto the bench beside him with a gentle smile. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Want to talk about it?" Her natural teacher instincts kicked in as she studied his expression, recognizing the signs of a teenager struggling with emotions too big for him to process alone. Antonio looked up with surprise and relief, his face brightening at the sight of his unexpected friend. "Emily, what are you doing here? I thought you had that interview downtown today." His concern for her was evident as he shifted to give her more room on the bench, unconsciously seeking the comfort of her presence. "It didn't go well," Emily admitted with a rueful laugh, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "But that's not important right now. You look upset, and I'm a pretty good listener if you want to share what's bothering you." She had always been good at connecting with young people, and something about Antonio's vulnerability reminded her of why she had chosen teaching as her profession. "It's my dad," Antonio said quietly, staring at his hands. He's been different since Mom died, and I know he's trying his best. But sometimes I feel like we're both just going through the motions. He works all the time, and when he's home, he's either worried about business or worried about me getting into trouble. I just wish... He trailed off, unable to articulate the longing in his heart. Emily felt her chest tighten with empathy as she recognized the grief and confusion in the teenager's voice. Losing a parent changes everything, she said gently, drawing from her own experience of losing her father when she was young. Your dad is probably struggling just as much as you are, but adults sometimes think they have to be strong all the time, even when they're falling apart inside. That's exactly it, Antonio said, turning to look at her with wide eyes. You understand him better than most people do, and you've only met him once. That's why I hoped maybe. He seemed to be wrestling with how to express his thoughts without sounding foolish or inappropriate. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Massimo's voice calling Antonio's name, his tone carrying both concern and authority. Emily looked up to see the imposing man striding across the park toward them, his expensive suit looking somewhat out of place among the casual park-goers. His expression was a mixture of relief at finding his son and wariness at seeing Emily with him. There you are, Massimo said as he approached, his dark eyes moving between his son and Emily with careful assessment. You left school early without calling, and your security detail lost track of you. I was concerned. His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to having his instructions followed without question. But Emily noticed the genuine worry beneath his authoritative exterior. I'm sorry, Mr. Castellano, Emily said, rising from the bench with an apologetic expression. Antonio seemed upset, and I was just trying to be a good listener. I didn't mean to cause any worry or interfere with your family. She gathered her purse, preparing to leave them to sort out their family business. But Antonio's disappointed expression made her hesitate. Please don't go, Antonio said quickly, looking between his father and Emily with hopeful eyes. Dad, Emily was just helping me figure some things out. She's really good at understanding people, and she makes me feel less alone with everything. His voice carried a vulnerability that made both adults pause, recognizing the depth of his need for connection and understanding. Massimo studied Emily's face as she stood there, clearly uncomfortable with being in the middle of a family situation, but also genuinely concerned about his son's well-being. There was something about her presence that seemed to bring out a lighter side of Antonio. And despite his concerns about outsiders, he found himself reluctant to send her away if she was helping his son heal. 2 weeks had passed since the park encounter, and Emily found herself becoming a regular presence in the Castellano household, though she still didn't fully understand the nature of Massimo's business. Antonio had practically adopted her as his honorary big sister, and she had to admit that spending time with the lonely teenager had become one of the highlights of her struggling days. What she didn't expect was how much she would begin to look forward to her conversations with Massimo himself. Emily, can I ask you something? Antonio said one evening as they sat in the penthouse kitchen, working on his English homework while the aroma of homemade marinara sauce filled the air. The kitchen was a masterpiece of modern design with granite countertops and professional-grade appliances. But Emily had made it feel warm and welcoming with her presence. Do you think my dad likes you? The question caught Emily completely off guard, nearly causing her to choke on her coffee. What kind of question is that? She asked, her cheeks flushing as she tried to maintain her composure. Your father and I barely know each other, Antonio. I'm just here because you've been kind enough to invite me, and he's been gracious enough to tolerate my presence. But you do like him, don't you? Antonio pressed, his teenage intuition picking up on the subtle signs that adults thought they were hiding. I see how you smile when he talks about his work, even though you don't really understand what he does. And Dad actually laughs when you're around, which he hasn't done since Mom died. Before Emily could respond, the sound of raised voices from Massimo's study cut through their conversation, followed by the unmistakable sound of men discussing territories, shipments, and percentages that had nothing to do with legitimate business. Emily's blood ran cold, as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't wanted to solve suddenly clicked into place in her mind. "What kind of work does your father actually do?" Emily asked quietly, her teacher instincts recognizing danger even when she didn't want to acknowledge it. The expensive clothes, the security detail, the way people deferred to Massimo, the late-night meetings, everything suddenly made terrible sense, and she felt naive for not recognizing the signs earlier. Antonio's expression shifted from playful to serious as he realized his mistake in bringing Emily into their world without properly preparing her for the truth. "Emily, you have to understand, my dad isn't a bad person. He's just complicated. His business isn't exactly..." He struggled to find words that would make their reality sound less dangerous than it actually was. The study door opened abruptly, and Massimo emerged with two men in expensive suits, their conversation ending abruptly when they spotted Emily in the kitchen. The tension in the air was palpable as Massimo's associates studied her with a kind of calculating looks that made her skin crawl. She had inadvertently overheard information that could put her in serious danger, and everyone in the room knew it. "Gentlemen, this is Emily, Antonio's tutor," Massimo said smoothly, his voice carrying a warning that his associates immediately understood. "She's been helping him with his studies and has become quite close to our family. I trust that won't be a problem for anyone." The threat beneath his polite words was unmistakable, and Emily felt both protected and terrified by his obvious willingness to defend her. "Of course not, Don Castellano," one of the men replied with a respectful nod, though his eyes remained fixed on Emily with uncomfortable intensity. "We were just leaving anyway. The matters we discussed can be finalized through the usual channels." The formal way they addressed Massimo confirmed Emily's worst fears about the true nature of his business operations. After the men left, an uncomfortable silence settled over the penthouse as Emily tried to process what she had learned. Massimo was clearly a high-ranking member of organized crime, which explained the luxury, the security, and the way people treated him with a mixture of respect and fear. She was sitting in the home of a man who operated outside the law, and her growing feelings for him suddenly seemed both foolish and dangerous. "Emily," Massimo said quietly, approaching her with careful steps as if she were a frightened animal that might bolt at any moment. "I understand this changes things between us. You're free to leave, and you'll never be bothered by anyone connected to my world again. I give you my word on that." His voice carried a sadness that suggested he had been expecting this moment and dreading it. "Is that what you want?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she met his dark eyes. "For me to leave and pretend none of this ever happened?" Despite her fear, she found herself thinking about Antonio's loneliness, about the way Massimo's expression softened when he looked at her, about the family they had all started to become without anyone officially acknowledging it. "What I want and what's safe for you are two very different things," Massimo replied, his hands clenched at his sides as he fought the urge to reach for her. "You don't belong in this world, Emily. You're good and pure and deserving of a normal life with someone who can give you the future you deserve, not a man whose enemies would use you to hurt him." Antonio had been listening to the exchange with growing panic, realizing that his decision to bring Emily into their lives might be about to tear apart the closest thing to happiness either he or his father had experienced in years. "Dad, please," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Emily isn't like other people. She cares about us. Really cares, not because of money or power, but because she sees who we really are underneath all the business stuff." Emily looked between father and son, seeing the fear and hope warring in both their expressions, and realized that this moment would define not just her future, but theirs as well. She thought about the empty apartment waiting for her in Queens, the endless job rejections, the loneliness that had become her constant companion. Then she thought about Antonio's laughter, Massimo's rare smiles, and the feeling of belonging that had grown stronger with each day she spent in their home. "I need time to think," Emily said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is a lot to process, and I need to understand what staying would really mean for all of us." She gathered her purse and jacket, noting how both Castellano men watched her movements with barely concealed anxiety, neither wanting to influence her decision, but both desperately hoping she would choose to stay. Emily spent 3 sleepless nights in her cramped studio apartment, weighing the impossible decision before her. On one hand, everything logical told her to run from the Castellano family and their dangerous world before she got in too deep. On the other hand, her heart kept reminding her of Antonio's progress, his laughter, and the way he had started calling her M, with the affection of a younger brother who had found his missing piece. Meanwhile, Massimo was struggling with his own internal war, finding himself unable to concentrate on business as he waited for Emily's decision. His associates had begun to notice his distraction, and questions were being asked about the woman who had suddenly disappeared from their lives. He found himself drinking expensive whiskey alone in his study, staring at the chair where Emily used to sit while helping Antonio with homework. "You're being an idiot, Dad," Antonio announced on the 4th day, bursting into his father's study with the kind of teenage directness that cut through adult complications. "Emily loves us, real love, not the fake kind that people show you because they're afraid or want something. When's the last time someone looked at you and saw just Massimo? Not Don Castellano?" The truth in his son's words hit Massimo like a physical blow, because he couldn't remember the last time someone had made him feel like a man rather than a title. Emily had never once asked about his business, never seemed impressed by his wealth or power, never treated him with the careful deference that everyone else showed. She argued with him about movies, laughed at his terrible cooking attempts, and fell asleep on his couch reading books to Antonio. Emily's phone rang just as she was preparing for another restless night, and Massimo's name on the caller ID made her heart race with anticipation and anxiety. She had been expecting this call, dreading it and hoping for it in equal measure, knowing that whatever he said would force her to finally make a decision about her future. "There's something I need to show you." Massimo's voice was quiet, almost vulnerable when she answered. "If you're willing to come back, just for tonight. After that, if you still want to leave, I'll arrange for you to start fresh anywhere in the country. New identity, new job, enough money to build whatever life you want. But first, I want you to understand who we really are." Against her better judgment, Emily found herself agreeing to meet him, and an hour later, she was sitting in his bulletproof Mercedes as they drove through the streets of Little Italy. Massimo had dismissed his usual security detail, which she was beginning to understand was a significant gesture of trust and vulnerability in his world. "My grandfather started with nothing when he came from Sicily," Massimo began, his voice taking on a storytelling quality as they passed through neighborhoods where his family's influence was evident in subtle ways. "He built legitimate businesses, but he also protected people when the law couldn't or wouldn't. My father expanded that protection, and I've tried to modernize it, to make it less about violence and more about community." They stopped in front of a small community center in a neighborhood that Emily recognized as being rough around the edges, the kind of place where city services were limited and hope was in short supply. To her surprise, the building was bustling with activity despite the late hour, and she could see children inside doing homework under the supervision of volunteer tutors. "We fund this place," Massimo explained as they watched a young mother picking up her children after her late shift at work. "The after-school program, the meals, the tutoring, the safe transportation home. The city says there's no money for programs like this, but kids like Antonio need somewhere to go after school, somewhere they can be kids instead of lookouts for drug dealers." Emily felt her preconceptions being challenged as she watched the obvious affection and respect the community members showed Massimo when they recognized him through the car window. These weren't people who feared him. They were people who trusted him to keep his word and protect their families when no one else would. The business you overheard, Massimo continued, his voice becoming more serious. It's not what most people think. Yes, we operate outside the law sometimes, but we fill gaps that legitimate society leaves open. We provide security for businesses the police can't protect. We mediate disputes that the courts would take years to resolve. And we make sure families like these have what they need to survive. And your enemies? Emily asked quietly, thinking about the danger he had mentioned earlier. The people who would hurt me to get to you? She needed to understand the full scope of what she would be accepting if she chose to stay in their lives. Massimo's expression darkened as he considered her question. There are other families who don't appreciate our methods, who think we've gone soft by trying to build rather than just take. There are federal agents who see all of us as criminals regardless of what we actually do. And there are ambitious men within our own organization who think leadership should be about fear rather than respect. The weight of his honesty settled between them, as Emily began to understand that choosing this life would mean accepting not just love and family, but genuine danger and moral complexity. She thought about the alternative: safety, loneliness, and the gradual death of the dreams she had been nurturing since meeting the Castellanos. "What exactly are you asking of me?" Emily said finally, turning to meet his intense gaze in the dim light of the car. "Because I need to know what I'm choosing between." Her heart was already making the decision, but her mind needed to understand the practical realities of what she was considering. "I'm asking you to trust me to protect you, to let Antonio keep the closest thing to a mother he's had since Maria died, and to give us a chance to build something real together." Massimo replied, his voice raw with honesty. "I'm asking you to marry me, Emily, not just for love, but for protection. As my wife, you'd be untouchable to my enemies, and our family would finally be complete." Emily's breath caught in her throat as Massimo's unexpected proposal hung in the air between them, the weight of his words settling over her like a blanket that was both comforting and terrifying. She had been prepared for many possibilities during this conversation, but a marriage proposal in the front seat of an armored Mercedes while discussing organized crime hadn't been one of them. The practical teacher in her wanted to analyze every angle, but her heart was already racing ahead to imagine what their life together could become. "You're asking me to marry you for protection," Emily said slowly, trying to process the complexity of emotion swirling through her chest. "But what about love, Massimo? What about the fact that we've known each other for less than a month? And half of that time I didn't even know who you really were?" Her voice carried a mixture of hope and fear as she searched his face for the truth behind his proposal. Massimo turned in his seat to face her fully, his dark eyes reflecting the streetlights as he struggled to find words for feelings he had been suppressing since the day Antonio brought her home. "The protection is practical, yes, but Emily, I haven't felt this way about anyone since Maria died. You've brought light back into our house, given Antonio hope again, and made me remember what it feels like to want something beyond business and survival." Before she could respond, Massimo's phone buzzed with an urgent message that made his expression immediately harden with concern. Emily watched as he quickly scanned the text, his body language shifting from vulnerable suitor to dangerous protector in a matter of seconds. The transformation was both frightening and oddly reassuring as she realized the depth of his commitment to keeping those he cared about safe. "We need to get back to the house now," Massimo said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone she had learned to recognize as his crisis management mode. "There's been a development with the Torino family that could affect Antonio's safety, and I need to know he's secure before we continue this conversation." He was already putting the car in drive, his mind shifting to tactical thinking even as Emily could see the frustration in his expression at the interruption. The ride back to the penthouse was tense, with Massimo making several phone calls in rapid Italian, while Emily tried to understand the implications of what was happening. She caught enough words to know that some kind of territorial dispute was escalating, and that Massimo's enemies were making moves that threatened the fragile peace he had been maintaining in their section of the city. They arrived at the building to find it under discreet but heavy security, with men in expensive suits positioned at strategic points throughout the lobby and parking garage. Emily's anxiety spiked as she realized this wasn't a drill or precaution, but a genuine threat that required immediate and serious response. The doorman nodded respectfully to Massimo, but kept his hand near his concealed weapon as they passed. "Antonio!" Massimo called as they entered the penthouse, his voice carrying both authority and parental concern. The teenager emerged from his room with worried eyes, clearly aware that something significant was happening based on the increased security presence and his father's obvious tension. Emily's heart went out to him as she realized how often he must have experienced this kind of fear and uncertainty. "Dad, what's going on?" Antonio asked, moving instinctively closer to Emily as if her presence provided comfort in the midst of chaos. "The security guys have been here for an hour, and nobody will tell me anything except that I need to stay inside until further notice." His voice carried the frustrated anxiety of a young person who understood danger but was kept in the dark about specifics. "Vincent Torino is making a play for our territory," Massimo explained, his tone becoming more serious as he gathered his family around him. "He's been testing our defenses for weeks, and tonight he crossed a line that I can't ignore. This means we'll be dealing with increased security measures for the foreseeable future. And both of you need to understand what that means for your daily lives." Emily felt the reality of Massimo's world crashing down around her as she realized that choosing this family would mean living with the constant possibility of violence and danger. Yet as she looked at Antonio's fearful expression and Massimo's protective stance, she found herself moving closer to them rather than backing away. Whatever her decision about the proposal, these people had become her family, and she couldn't abandon them in their moment of need. "Emily," Massimo said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "I need you to make your decision now. If you're staying, you need to move in tonight so my security team can protect you properly. If you're leaving, it has to be before morning, while we can still ensure your safe transportation out of the city." The urgency in his voice made it clear that neutrality was no longer an option. The weight of the moment pressed down on Emily as she realized that everything in her life had led to this crossroads. She could choose safety and solitude, returning to her empty apartment and uncertain future, or she could choose love and danger, accepting the protection and complications that came with joining the Castellano family. The logical choice was obvious, but her heart was screaming for her to stay. "I want to stay," Emily said firmly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Not just for tonight, but for whatever comes next. I choose you, both of you, and whatever that means for our future." She reached for both Massimo and Antonio's hands, symbolically completing their family circle, as the world outside continued to pose threats to their happiness. Antonio's face lit up with joy and relief as he realized Emily had chosen to become a permanent part of their lives, while Massimo's expression showed a mixture of love, gratitude, and fierce determination to protect the woman who had just committed to sharing their dangerous but love-filled existence. "Then we do this properly," Massimo said, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket that he had been carrying since their conversation began. "Emily Martinez, will you marry me and become Antonio's mother and my partner in everything that comes next?" Through tears of joy and terror, Emily looked at the ring, a simple but elegant solitaire that somehow perfectly captured both the luxury and understated elegance that defined the Castellano family. "Yes," she whispered. Then more strongly, "Yes, I'll marry you, Massimo. I'll be Antonio's mother, your wife, and whatever else this family needs me to be." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, all three of them knew that their lives had just changed forever. For better and worse, in sickness and health, in danger and safety. 3 months had passed since Emily's engagement to Massimo, and their Fifth Avenue penthouse had transformed from a bachelor's fortress into a genuine family home. The formal dining room now hosted homework sessions and family game nights, while the pristine kitchen had become Emily's domain, filled with the aromas of comfort food and the sounds of laughter that had been missing for too long. The changes were subtle but profound, turning a house into a home through the simple addition of love and feminine warmth. Emily had discovered that being engaged to a mafia don came with unexpected responsibilities and protocols that no one had warned her about. There were wives' luncheons with other families, where conversations were coded, and alliances were carefully maintained through social pleasantries. She had to learn which restaurants were safe, which routes to take through the city, and how to smile graciously while armed bodyguards followed her every movement. Mrs. Castellano, Giuseppe, their head of security, said respectfully as Emily prepared to leave for her weekly volunteer work at the animal shelter. Don Massimo asked me to remind you that we need to vary your route today. There's been some chatter from the Torino family, and he wants to ensure your safety. The formal way the staff had begun addressing her still felt surreal, but she was beginning to understand the respect and protection that came with her new status. Antonio had flourished under Emily's consistent presence and maternal guidance, his grades improving dramatically while his sullen teenager attitude transformed into something closer to genuine happiness. She attended his soccer games, helped him with college applications, and provided the kind of steady emotional support that Massimo's demanding schedule sometimes made difficult. The boy had started calling her Mom without fanfare, as if the title had always belonged to her. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Antonio said one evening as they prepared dinner together, his voice carrying the slightly nervous tone that usually preceded important teenager conversations. Emily had learned to recognize these moments as opportunities for real connection, times when she needed to put down whatever she was doing and give him her full attention. "Of course, sweetheart," Emily replied, turning away from the stove to focus entirely on his expression. "What's on your mind?" She had developed an intuitive understanding of his moods and needs, recognizing when he needed guidance, comfort, or simply someone to listen without judgment. "Do you ever regret choosing us?" Antonio asked quietly, his teenage vulnerability showing through his increasingly mature exterior. "I mean, you gave up your normal life, your teaching career, everything you had planned, just to take care of Dad and me. Sometimes I wonder if we've asked too much of you." His concern was genuine and touching, revealing the depth of his emotional growth since Emily had become part of their family. Emily felt her heart swell with love for this thoughtful young man, who had somehow become her son in every way that mattered. "Antonio, choosing your family was the best decision I've ever made," she said firmly, reaching out to cup his face in her hands. "Yes, my life changed completely, but it changed into something better than I ever imagined possible. You and your father gave me a purpose and a love that I didn't even know I was missing." The conversation was interrupted by Massimo's arrival, home from a particularly long day of meetings, his expression showing the strain of managing both legitimate businesses and the complex politics of their world. Emily had learned to read his moods from the way he carried his shoulders, the set of his jaw, and the depth of the lines around his eyes when he was dealing with particularly difficult situations. "How did the meeting with the construction union go?" Emily asked, moving into his arms for the kind of welcome home embrace that had become their daily ritual. She had discovered that being Massimo's wife meant being his confidant and emotional anchor, the person he could be vulnerable with when the weight of leadership became too heavy to bear alone. "Better than expected," Massimo replied, his tension visibly melting away as he held her close. "They agreed to our terms for the community center expansion, which means we can break ground next month. Having you at the neighborhood meeting last week made a real difference. They trust us more when they see we're a real family, not just a business operation." His voice carried genuine appreciation for the way Emily had embraced her role as a Don's wife. bringing warmth and authenticity to relationships that had previously been purely transactional. Emily had discovered that her background as a teacher translated surprisingly well to her new role in the family business, particularly when it came to community outreach and the legitimate enterprises they used to give back to their neighborhoods. She had a natural ability to connect with families, understand their needs, and develop programs that actually made a difference in people's lives. "Speaking of the community center," Emily said, settling onto the couch with Massimo while Antonio finished his homework at the kitchen table. "I've been thinking about starting an adult education program there. There are so many people in the neighborhood who want to improve their English or get their GED but can't afford traditional classes." Her eyes lit up with the kind of passion that had originally drawn her to teaching, now channeled into helping their extended community family. Massimo listened to her ideas with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for important business discussions, recognizing that Emily's insights into community needs had become invaluable to their operations. She understood people in a way that complemented his understanding of power and protection, creating a partnership that was making their family's influence more positive and sustainable. "We'll make it happen," Massimo said decisively, already mentally allocating resources for Emily's program. "Whatever you need, space, materials, security, funding, consider it done. Your instincts about what people need have been right every time, and I trust your judgment completely." The respect in his voice reflected the genuine partnership their marriage had become, built on mutual admiration and shared goals. As they sat together planning their future projects, Emily marveled at how completely her life had changed and how right it all felt. She was no longer the struggling teacher whose biggest problem was paying rent. She was now a woman with the resources and platform to make real changes in people's lives, protected by a man who would move heaven and earth to keep her safe, and trusted with the care of a son who had filled a space in her heart she hadn't known was empty. "I love you both," Emily said suddenly, her voice thick with emotion as she looked between Massimo and Antonio. "I love this life we've built together, this family we've become, and the future we're creating. Thank you for choosing me, for trusting me, and for letting me be part of something so much bigger than I ever imagined possible." Her words carried the weight of genuine gratitude and deep contentment, the kind that comes from finding your true place in the world. 2 years had passed since Emily Martinez became Emily Castellano, and the transformation of their family had exceeded everyone's expectations. The penthouse that had once been a fortress of solitude now rang with the sounds of a household filled with love, laughter, and the comfortable chaos that comes with a genuinely happy home. Emily had not only adapted to her role as a mafia don's wife, but had revolutionized what that position could mean for both the family and their community. Antonio, now 18 and preparing for college, had grown into a confident young man who spoke openly about his gratitude for the mother who had chosen their family when they needed her most. His college essay, which Emily had helped him craft, told the story of how love could transform a broken family into something stronger than any of them had imagined possible. He had been accepted to Columbia University with plans to study social work. Inspired by Emily's community programs and his father's protective instincts. "Mom, I need to tell you something," Antonio said one spring morning as they sat in their expanded kitchen, now equipped with a breakfast nook where family meetings had become a cherished tradition. His voice carried the excitement of someone bursting with good news, and Emily immediately gave him her full attention, setting down her coffee cup and turning to face him completely. "I've been thinking about what I want to do after college," Antonio continued, his words tumbling out with enthusiasm. "I want to expand what you and Dad have built here, maybe start a foundation that helps other families like ours. Kids who've lost parents, communities that need protection and resources, people who fall through the cracks of regular social services." His vision was ambitious and heartwarming, combining the best aspects of both his parents' approaches to helping others. Emily felt tears prick her eyes, as she realized how completely Antonio had internalized the values they had tried to instill in him. The importance of family, the responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and the understanding that real power came from lifting others up rather than keeping them down. "That sounds like exactly the kind of work you were meant to do," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Your father and I will support you however we can." Massimo had undergone his own transformation during their marriage, discovering that having Emily's support and perspective allowed him to pursue the more legitimate and community-focused aspects of his business with greater confidence and success. The construction company, restaurant chain, and security services had all expanded under his leadership, providing jobs and stability for hundreds of families while serving as a bridge between their traditional operations and a more sustainable future. "The city wants to give us a community service award," Massimo announced that evening as they gathered for dinner, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and irony at the recognition. "Apparently, our youth programs and neighborhood development initiatives have had such a positive impact that they want to publicly acknowledge our contributions. The mayor herself wants to present the award at a ceremony next month." Emily laughed at the beautiful irony of a mafia family being recognized by the very government that had once considered them enemies, understanding that their success came from finding ways to work within the system rather than against it. "Will you accept it?" she asked, knowing that public recognition came with both benefits and risks in their world. "We'll accept it together," Massimo replied, emphasizing the partnership that had become the foundation of everything they accomplished. "You've been the driving force behind most of these programs, and the community sees you as the heart of our family's commitment to making their lives better. This award belongs to all of us." His recognition of her contributions reflected the genuine respect and equality that had developed in their marriage. The community center had indeed become the crown jewel of their neighborhood improvement efforts, offering everything from after-school programs and adult education classes to job training and family counseling services. Emily had recruited teachers, social workers, and volunteers from across the city, creating a network of support that addressed the root causes of poverty and desperation, rather than simply managing their symptoms. Mrs. Castellano, Maria Santos, one of the adult education students, approached Emily after class one evening, her eyes shining with pride and gratitude. "I wanted you to know that I got the promotion at the hospital. The English classes you taught me made all the difference in my interview. My children will have a better life because you believed in me when no one else would." These moments of genuine impact had become Emily's greatest source of satisfaction, confirming that her choice to join this family had created ripple effects of positive change throughout their community. As Emily and Massimo walked home that evening, hand in hand through streets that had become safer and more prosperous under their family's influence, they reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them together. What had started as a teenager's impulsive desire to find his father a companion had evolved into a love story that transformed not just their family, but an entire community. "Do you remember what you told me that first night?" Massimo asked, stopping under a streetlight to look into Emily's eyes with the same intensity that had captured her heart 2 years earlier. "You said you needed time to think about what staying would mean for all of us. Did you ever imagine it would mean this?" He gestured to the thriving neighborhood around them, the home they had built together, and the future they were creating for Antonio and countless other families. "I imagine love," Emily replied honestly, her voice soft with contentment. "I imagined belonging somewhere, having a family, making a difference in the world. But what we've actually built together is so much bigger and more beautiful than anything I dared to dream." She stood on her tiptoes to kiss her husband, this man who had protected her, challenged her, and supported her in becoming the best version of herself. Their marriage had proven that love could indeed conquer all obstacles when it was built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and unwavering commitment to protecting and nurturing the family they had chosen together. Emily Martinez the struggling teacher who had been humiliated in a restaurant 2 years earlier, had become Emily Castellano, a woman whose influence extended far beyond her own family, to touch the lives of hundreds of people who now had hope, opportunity, and protection because she had been brave enough to choose love over fear. As they reached their building, Emily looked up at the penthouse that had become their sanctuary and smiled at the warm light spilling from the windows where Antonio was probably finishing his homework or planning his next community project. This was home, not just a place, but a feeling of absolute belonging with the people who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, who had given her a purpose bigger than her own dreams, and who loved her unconditionally through every challenge and triumph. The future stretched before them, filled with Antonio's college graduation, community projects that would expand their positive impact, and the continued growth of a love that had started with a teenage boy's simple wish for his father to be happy again. Emily Castellano had found her calling, her family, and her forever home in the most unexpected place, proving that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the words, "Dad, I found us a mom." Don't forget to follow our channel for more incredible stories of love, family, and the power of choosing to build something beautiful together, even in the most unexpected circumstances. Every family has a story worth telling. What's yours?